She walked into that chamber carrying everything she had ever hoped for, and he destroyed it in 11 words. Not with violence, not with cruelty performed for an audience, with the particular brutality of a man who had already decided what she was worth before she ever opened her mouth, who looked at her the way a general surveys terrain, useful or useless, obstacle or resource, nothing more. Duke Rowan Blackthorne stood by the window with his back to her on their wedding night, and when he finally turned, there was no anger in his face, no contempt. Something worse, indifference so complete it had calcified into architecture, into the very lines of his jaw. The candles threw gold across a room that should have belonged to a beginning. Instead, Seraphina Ashbourne felt the floor shift beneath her feet and understood, with the clarity that only real devastation delivers, that some doors don't open. They only ever pretend to. Stay to find out what she did next, because the woman he dismissed in 11 words would become the only reason his world did not collapse entirely. Well, part 1. The 11 words. The wedding had been flawless. That was the word the court used, flawless, as though perfection were a thing to be praised without irony when it described a transaction dressed in white silk and orange blossom, witnessed by 400 people who clapped and smiled and lifted their glasses to a union that had been arranged in a back room 3 months ago between two men who never once asked the woman at the center of it what she wanted. Seraphina Ashbourne had stood at the altar of Blackthorne Cathedral with her hands folded and her spine straight, and she had looked at the man beside her, Duke Rowan Blackthorne, 29 years old, heir to the oldest title in the Northern Territories, possessed of a face that painters would have paid to ruin their careers over, and a reputation that made lesser nobles step aside in hallways before he reached them. And she had told herself, "This is enough. This is more than most women get. You will make it enough." She had been 19 when her father first mentioned the Blackthorne name, 22 when the negotiations concluded, 23 on the morning she put on the dress. 3 years of waiting, and she had used them. She had read every account of the duchy she could obtain, its trade routes, its agricultural failures, its old alliances and newer fractures. She had studied estate management with the kind of focus other young women directed at needlepoint and piano. She had told herself she was preparing, that preparation was a form of hope, and hope was not a weakness if you were careful about where you placed it. She had placed it carefully in the idea that a man clever enough to hold the most complicated political territory in the North might recognize, eventually, a woman worth knowing. The ceremony lasted 2 hours. Rowan Blackthorne stood beside her with his jaw set and his eyes forward, and he said the words the officiant gave him with the flat precision of a man reciting inventory. He did not look at her when he said them. He looked at the stained glass above the altar as though calculating structural load. She thought, "He is nervous. Men like him don't know what to do with ceremony." She thought, "He will be different in private." She thought a great many things in those 2 hours that the evening would dismantle one by one. The reception stretched into midnight. She danced when she was expected to dance. She smiled when she was expected to smile. The court circled her with the bright, shallow interest they extended to anything new. The new duchess, young and composed, dark-haired and quiet. The Ashbourne girl, good bloodlines, decent dowry, not spectacular but serviceable. She heard the assessments in fragments, through champagne and string quartets, and she felt them settle on her skin like a second dress, one she hadn't chosen. Rowan danced with her once, at the beginning, because protocol demanded it. His hand was at her waist, and his face was 2 feet from hers, and she felt the specific electricity of proximity to someone who has made no decision about you yet, whose attention might still tip in any direction. She said something small and honest. She no longer remembered exactly what, only that it had been genuine, that she had reached toward him with it the way you reach toward a flame to test the heat. He looked at her with those dark eyes, steady and measuring, and said nothing. Smiled with one corner of his mouth in a way that meant absolutely nothing. And then the music changed and the dance ended, and he moved away to speak with the Duke of Harwell and did not look at her again for the rest of the evening. By the time the castle's senior chamberlain, an elderly man named Aldrich, with the soft and careful voice of someone who had long ago learned to deliver difficult information without inflection, appeared at her side to inform her that it was time to retire to the Duke's chambers. Seraphina had been awake for 17 hours and had eaten almost nothing, and was operating on the specific energy that comes from months of anticipation reaching their terminal point. She followed Aldrich through corridors she didn't yet know, past doors she couldn't yet name, up a staircase that opened onto the East Wing's private quarters, and she was aware of every step because she was trying to memorize this place, her place now, trying to begin the long work of belonging somewhere. Aldrich stopped before a pair of heavy oak doors banded in iron, knocked twice, and stepped aside. From within, "Enter." She entered. The Duke's private chamber was large and severe in the way of rooms that have been arranged by someone with no interest in comfort. A desk cleared of everything except a single lamp and a folded document, bookshelves along the north wall, a fireplace burning low, a bed that occupied the far end of the room like a geographical feature, dark wood and dark linen, and no excess anywhere. The curtains were drawn back from the window that faced east, and Rowan was standing there, one hand resting on the stone ledge, looking out at the darkness of the grounds below. He still wore his wedding coat. The buttons at his throat were undone. That was the only concession to the end of a long day. 3 buttons, loosened. He did not turn when she entered. She stood in the doorway for a moment and she thought, say something first. Make it easy. And then she thought, why should I? And then she crossed the room anyway, because she had come here with the intention of beginning something, and beginnings required at least one person willing to move. The evening went well, I think, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. The court seemed pleased. Lord Harwell's speech was, "You can stop." The words were quiet. Not harsh, not cold exactly. Colder than cold, the way absolute zero is colder than cold. A temperature past the reach of ordinary measurement. She stopped. He turned from the window then, looked at her with those measuring eyes, and she watched him make some final assessment, some small internal calculation reaching its conclusion, and whatever he saw in the result, it wasn't the thing that moves a man toward warmth. "This marriage," he said, "is a political arrangement. I want you to understand that clearly and from the beginning so there are no complications later." She said nothing. "You will have your own rooms. You will manage the social obligations that come with your position. You will be treated with the respect the title demands. That is what I can offer you, and it is what you will receive." He paused, looked at her without apology. "Stay out of my life, Lady Blackthorne. Run yours. We'll get along fine." 11 words. Stay out of my life, Lady Blackthorne. Run yours. She stood in the center of that room, and the fire burned low behind her, and the candles on the desk threw a narrow gold light, and she was 23 years old, and she had spent 3 years of her life becoming someone she believed could build something in this place. And the man who had said her name for the first time as his wife had just used it to tell her she didn't matter. Something moved through her, hot first, then cold, the specific sequence of a wound locating itself. She felt it travel from her chest outward, into her hands, and she was very careful to keep her hands still. "I understand," she said. It was the only thing she trusted herself to say. He nodded, once, with the relief of a man who has delivered an unpleasant necessity and finds it concluded, and turned back to the window. She left. The room they gave her was in the west wing, 3 corridors away from the chamber she had just walked out of. It was a decent room, large enough, adequately furnished, with a window that looked over the kitchen gardens. A fire had been laid. Someone had placed a nightgown across the foot of the bed with the anonymous care of servants who follow instructions and ask no questions. Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the fire. She did not cry. She had cried twice in her life from pain rather than frustration, and she was very particular about when she spent those tears, and this was not one of those times. What she felt was not grief, not yet. Grief required time to accumulate what it needed, required you to have fully believed in the thing you were losing. What she felt was something more elemental, the precise sensation of a door closing, very quietly, in a room you had been certain was yours. She sat with it. Let it settle. Outside, the castle went through its nightly rituals, the last of the reception guests finding their coaches, the servants banking fires and clearing the last of the celebration, the gradual diminishing of sound that was a large house going to sleep around its indifference. She thought about her mother, who had pressed her hands before the ceremony and said, "He is a powerful man. Powerful men are not kind, Seraphina, but they can be useful if you are cleverer than they expect." She had thought then that her mother was being unkind. She understood now that her mother had been trying to arm her. She thought about what she had seen in the year's worth of accounts she had studied. The duchy bleeding money through a dozen quiet wounds, officials skimming from the estate funds with the comfortable confidence of men who believed no one was paying close enough attention. 3 villages in the southern territories running trade deficits that would collapse them within 2 years if nothing changed. An agricultural system built on methods 40 years out of date. She thought, "He told me to run my life. He didn't specify what that meant. Stay out of my life, not stay out of my duchy, not stay out of my affairs. My life." She had a title now. She had access. She had apparently all the latitude in the world to do whatever she wished with her existence, because the man she had married had made very clear that her existence was not his concern. By the time the fire burned to coals, she had made her decision. Not dramatically. There was no thunderclap of defiance, no righteous rage, no speech delivered to a darkened room. She made it the way she made most decisions, quietly, practically, with the full knowledge of what it would cost. She would never beg Rowan Blackthorne for anything, not his attention, not his affection, not his acknowledgement that she was a person worth reckoning with. She would not seek those things because seeking them had already failed, and she was not a woman who made the same mistake twice. Instead, she was going to learn this duchy the way she would learn a language, until she thought in it, until its rhythms were her own, until no one could operate within it without her knowing. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming. Alt. The estate secretary's name was Fordham, and he did not know what to do with her. She appeared at his office door 3 days after the wedding, while Rowan was away on business in the capital, and she said she would like access to the estate accounts, the last 5 years of them if possible, and she would also like to speak with the steward of each of the 7 villages within the Blackthorne territory at his earliest arrangement of convenience. Fordham was 54 years old and had worked for the previous duke and the one before that, and he had a specific experience of noble wives that had solidified over 3 decades into something close to geological fact. They asked about the social calendar. Occasionally they had opinions about the kitchens or the gardens, and they did not read accounts. He looked at Seraphina Ashbourne, the new Duchess Blackthorne, sitting across from him with her hands folded on his desk, and her dark eyes carrying the patient, unhurried attention of a woman who had already decided how this conversation was going to end, and he said, "Of course, my lady. I'll have copies sent to your rooms." "I'll read them here," she said. "Today, if you have space. I won't need much." She read for 6 hours. She made notes in a small leather journal she had carried with her, and she asked questions at intervals, quiet, specific questions that required real answers and couldn't be deflected with generalities, and Fordham found himself answering them with increasing unease, not because the questions were hostile, but because they were accurate. And accuracy in the wrong hands was its own kind of threat. By the end of the afternoon, she had identified 4 separate channels through which funds were exiting the estate without adequate justification. She said nothing about this directly. She thanked Fordham for his time, asked him to arrange meetings with the village stewards, and left. He sat at his desk for a long time after. She met the village stewards over the following 2 weeks, riding out to each village herself rather than summoning them to the castle. A choice that was noted and discussed, and that she understood would be noted and discussed, because everything a duchess did in her first weeks was dissected for meaning by people with nothing more interesting to do. She let them look. She was interested in what the villages needed, not what the court thought of her riding habits. The first village, Turnmouth, was the worst. She arrived to find 1/3 of the harvest still ungathered. A labor shortage no one had flagged to the estate office, the result of a fever that had moved through the working-age population that summer. The remaining villagers had done what they could, but what they could do wasn't enough, and the shortfall would take them under by February without intervention. She spoke with the village head, an older woman named Gareth, who had the weathered patience of someone accustomed to watching help not arrive. Gareth gave her the numbers, didn't dress them, looked at Seraphina with eyes that said, "You're very young and very new, and I have seen young and new before." Seraphina said, I'm going to arrange to have workers from the castle grounds sent down for 2 weeks. Seasonal contract, paid from the estate fund under discretionary allocation. I'll need you to show me exactly what's needed and in what order." Gareth looked at her for a moment. "The Duke approved this?" she said. "The Duke," Seraphina said, "asked me to manage my responsibilities. This falls within them." Another moment of assessment. Then Gareth stood and said, "All right, let me show you the North Fields first." Bumped. She had been at Blackthorne 3 weeks when Rowan returned from the capital. She learned of his return the way she learned most things about his movements. Not from him, but from the particular shift in atmosphere that moved through a house when its principal figure arrived. The quickening of certain staff, the rearrangement of the dining schedule, the appearance of his coat on the hallway rack. They dined together that first evening because protocol required it, and because Seraphina had decided early that she would not avoid him. Avoidance was a form of acknowledgement that she would not give. The dining room was long and lit with more candles than necessary, and they sat at opposite ends of a table designed for 12. The distance was architectural, and also, she suspected, deliberate on someone's part. The housekeeper's idea of discretion, or possibly the cook's, or possibly just the habit of a house that had been managing the Duke's preference for space for years. Rowan arrived 3 minutes after she did. He wore a traveling coat not yet exchanged for evening dress, which meant either he'd been delayed or he hadn't thought the occasion warranted changing, and she had learned enough already to suspect the latter. He looked at her across the length of table, said nothing for a moment, then sat. "You've been riding out," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of information received. "Yes," she said. "I've been visiting the village stewards. Turnmouth needed immediate attention. There's a harvest shortfall that will create serious problems by midwinter if it's not addressed. I've arranged for workers to be sent from the estate grounds under discretionary allocation." He was still looking at her. Something in the quality of his attention changed slightly. She couldn't name it, didn't try. "You access discretionary funds," he said, "within the authorized limit for estate management. The expenditure will be documented." A pause. "Fordham didn't mention this." "Fordham and I have spoken several times. He's been helpful." She watched him process this. She ate her soup with the same composure she had used in his chamber 3 weeks ago, and she felt precisely nothing about his opinion of what she had done. Or rather, she felt something, but she had already decided that feeling would not go anywhere useful, and so she set it aside. "I didn't authorize additional expenditure from that fund," he said. "The allocation exists specifically for situations like this. The authorization is structural, not conditional on case-by-case approval. I checked." She set down her spoon. "If you'd prefer I document a justification for each individual decision going forward, I can do that. But the process will be slower." Another pause. Longer. He picked up his fork. "Document everything," he said. "I'll review it." "Of course," she said. They finished the meal in silence. It was not a comfortable silence, and it was not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of two people who have established, without negotiation, the terms by which they will occupy the same space without making demands of each other. She had expected to find it cold. She found instead that it was manageable, that managing it was, in fact, something she was quite good at. After, he stood to leave and paused at the doorway in a way that meant he was considering saying something and had not yet decided to. "The Turnmouth allocation," he said. "The amount?" She told him. He nodded once, left. She sat at the long empty table in the candlelight and thought about what it meant that he had asked, and then she stopped thinking about it, because she had learned, in these 3 weeks, that thinking too hard about Rowan Blackthorne was a form of spending herself in a direction that returned nothing, and she had other things to spend. The months moved. She uncovered the first of the corrupt officials in October. A supply controller named Hext, who had been diverting grain shipments from the estate stores to a private buyer for the better part of 3 years. The discrepancy buried in accounts rendered just complex enough to discourage close reading. She brought the documentation to Fordham without preamble and told him to initiate a formal audit and recommended the man be dismissed pending investigation. Fordham looked at the documents, looked at her, said he would need the Duke's approval. "Then get it," she said. Hext was dismissed by the end of the week. She did not know what Rowan said to Fordham in between. She did not ask. She learned the castle. She learned its history, the wars it had absorbed, the alliances it had survived, the slow territorial erosions of the past century that had left the duchy smaller and more complicated than the maps in the estate library suggested. She learned the staff, which ones were loyal, which ones had divided allegiances, which ones were simply waiting to see how this new arrangement settled before deciding where to land. She was careful, and she was consistent, and she made no promises she didn't intend to keep, and she asked no one for anything she couldn't arrange herself. She saw Rowan at meals when schedules aligned and at estate functions when both their presences were required, and twice in the hallway at hours late enough to imply neither of them was sleeping well. He said nothing personal to her in those months. Neither did she. They operated in parallel, two systems running adjacent without touching, and she had made her peace with that arrangement. What she had not made her peace with, what she refused to pretend she had made her peace with, in the private accounting she kept with herself in the quiet of her rooms, was the specific quality of his not looking. Because Rowan Blackthorne was a man who paid attention to everything. She had watched him work a room at estate functions, the way his eyes moved, the way he tracked conversation 3 exchanges ahead of where it appeared to be, the way he absorbed information about everyone around him with the appetite of a man for whom knowledge was the primary form of control. He paid attention to everything, and he had decided on the night of their wedding to pay no attention to her. She understood, from a cold, practical distance, that this was a wound she carried. She was not confused about that. She simply refused to do anything with it, except work. She saved 3 villages from collapse. She redirected an agricultural subsidy program that had been functionally useless for a decade into something that would produce measurable results within 2 growing seasons. She dismissed 2 more corrupt officials and restructured the relationship between the estate office and the village stewards so that problems could be escalated directly without passing through Heck's particular kind of bureaucratic friction. She did all of this with documents and meetings and the kind of patient, relentless competence that does not announce itself. The people of the duchy began to know her name, not as the duke's wife, as the woman who actually came when something was wrong. Rowan began to look at her across dinner tables with an expression she couldn't read. She stopped trying. It was a Thursday evening in late November when she found the letter. She had been in the estate library, cross-referencing a trade route assessment she'd commissioned against the duchy's historical records, when she opened the wrong drawer in the reference cabinet, one she hadn't yet had reason to access, and found, tucked beneath a sheaf of unrelated property surveys, a correspondence she was not meant to see. She recognized the seal immediately. House Verith, the Northern Coalition faction, old money and older grievances, currently the most significant political threat to the duchy's independent status. There were 3 letters, dated across the past 6 months, and she read them standing at the reference cabinet with the sound of her own breathing very loud in the quiet library. The letters were careful. They did not say anything directly. But men who write with the particular care of those planning something they cannot afford to have documented still leave traces, and Seraphina had been reading documents long enough to find them. What the letters described, in the elegant oblique language of men who trusted each other's intelligence, was a planned political maneuver against the duchy. It was not yet ready to move. The timeline, as best she could reconstruct it from the fragments and references, was spring. There was a vote pending before the Crown's Advisory Council, and if House Verith's coalition assembled correctly, and if Rowan arrived at that vote without sufficient political support, the duchy's autonomy could be stripped through legal process, absorbed into the Northern Territories coalition framework without a single sword being drawn, and tucked within the most recent letter, barely noted, almost incidental, a name she recognized. Not a noble, a man inside this castle. She stood in the library for a long time. She thought about going to Rowan, crossing the east wing, knocking at his door, placing the letters in his hands and saying, "Here, this is what is happening to your house." She thought about what his face would do when she walked in there with evidence of a threat he hadn't seen coming, evidence gathered from his own files, presented by a woman he had told, on his wedding night, to stay out of his life. She thought about what it would mean to him and whether it would change anything. She closed the drawer. She went to her rooms. She sat at her desk and took out her leather journal, the one she'd filled with months of notes and documents and careful observations, and she turned to a new page. And she began to build something. She did not know yet how far the conspiracy extended. She did not know how many names were involved or what the precise mechanism of the vote would be or how much time she had before it was set in motion. She knew the letters were a beginning, and she knew the name she had found was a thread, and she knew, with the cold certainty that had become her primary mode of operating in this place, that she was the only person in this castle who was going to pull it. Not for him. She had stopped doing things for him when he gave her reason to. She did it for the villages she had saved. For Gareth, who had looked at her with those weathered eyes and then stood up and showed her the north fields. For the 3 stewards who now brought their problems to her directly because they trusted she would do something with them. For the duchy she had decided, without asking anyone's permission, to consider hers. She worked through the night. By dawn she had a framework, the approach, the sources, the sequence of verification she would need to build something airtight enough to survive presentation before the crown. She had no idea it would take months. She had no idea what it would cost. She had no idea that the name she'd found in that letter was only the first layer, and that the one beneath it would be the thing that changed everything. Chet. The banquet in December was the first major court occasion since the wedding, and the castle filled with noble families from across the territory. And Seraphina stood in the receiving line beside her husband and smiled at 200 people and shook hands with some number of them who, she now knew from her months of careful work, were either complicit in what was being built against this house or were being positioned to benefit from it without understanding the mechanism. She watched Rowan work the room. She watched him do what he did. The command presence, the controlled charm, the particular political intelligence that had kept the duchy intact through pressures that had broken lesser houses. He was very good at this. She had not doubted that. What he didn't know, working that room, pressing flesh and reading faces with the precision of a man who had made himself into an instrument of political survival, was that 2 of the people he was speaking to had signed their names to a correspondence that would, if he arrived at the spring vote without intervention, end what his family had spent 4 centuries building. He laughed at something Lord Vareth himself said. Vareth smiled back, put a hand on his shoulder. Seraphina watched from across the room and felt the specific vertigo of knowing what someone does not know, the weight of information asymmetry, and she turned to speak with the Marchioness of Trent and kept her face exactly as it needed to be. Later, very much later, when the banquet had concluded and the guests had retired and the castle was quiet, she was in her rooms making notes when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Distinctive ones. She knew his stride now, in the way you know the particular sounds of a house you have inhabited long enough to feel, and they stopped outside her door. Stayed there. She heard nothing. No knock, no voice, just the specific quality of silence that means a person standing on the other side of wood, deciding something. Then the footsteps moved on. She sat at her desk for a long time after, journal open, pen in her hand, unable to write. She did not know what he had been going to say. She did not know if it mattered. What she knew, what she had confirmed that evening, watching him laugh with a man who intended to destroy him, was that she was not going to be able to give him the full picture of what was coming. Not yet. Not until she had more than fragments and implications. She needed another source. She needed access to the council calendar she didn't have. She needed to know which members of the estate staff were compromised. And she needed to find out without spooking the one name she had already identified. She needed, in other words, to go further than she had planned, into territory that was going to require her to use a resource she had been saving because she didn't trust herself to use it without it costing her something she wasn't ready to spend. She opened her desk's lower drawer and looked at the correspondence she had been drafting for 6 weeks without sending. The letter was addressed to her uncle, Lord Calum Ashbourne, the 3rd most powerful man in the Crown's advisory council, the man who had arranged her marriage to Rowan Blackthorne, the man who had told her, the night before her wedding, "Whatever happens, Seraphina, you are my blood, and my blood does not fail." She had not written to him in 3 months. She had not wanted to need to. She picked up the letter, read it through. At the bottom she added 3 lines she had not written before. Specific names, specific dates, a question whose answer she already suspected. She sealed it, put it in the morning dispatch box. Then she went to her window and looked out at the winter grounds of the Blackthorne Duchy. The grounds she had ridden across, the gardens she had walked through at odd hours with her journal, the paths she could now navigate without a lamp. And she thought about what it meant to have built something in a place where no one had asked her to build it, where the man whose name she carried had told her she didn't exist to him. She thought, "You will see me, not because I need you to, because by the time this is done, you will have no choice." Outside, past the dark grounds and the winter sky, a figure moved along the east wall. She almost dismissed it. Groundskeeper, night watchman, one of the stable boys. Except the groundskeepers used lanterns, and the night watchman followed a route she knew. She had learned the route because she had learned everything. And the figure was moving away from the route, moving toward the small side gate in the east wall that, according to the castle's records, was kept locked and had been kept locked since her arrival. The gate opened. The figure passed through. And Seraphina saw, for one moment before the darkness swallowed him, the profile of the man whose name she had found in the Vareth correspondence, the man who should have been asleep, the man who was, apparently, meeting someone. She stood at the window for 5 more seconds. Then she moved. She did not stop to think about whether it was wise. Thinking too hard about wisdom was what kept people standing at windows while the moment walked out the gate without them. Seraphina had learned that much in 23 years, that there was a specific kind of person who spent their whole life identifying the right time to act and dying before it arrived. She was not that person. She had decided not to be that person on a wedding night that had stripped her of every other option. She moved. Her coat was on the chair by the door, her boots where she'd left them, and she was dressed and through her own door in under 2 minutes, moving through the West Wing corridor with the particular silence of someone who had spent months learning which floorboards to avoid. She had learned them the way she had learned everything else about this castle, not because anyone offered to teach her, but because information was the only form of power available to a woman who had been told she had none. The East Wall Gate. She had read about it in the castle's structural survey, the document Fordham had given her in week 2 when she'd asked for the estate's physical inventory. A secondary gate, older than the main entrance by 60 years, installed during the expansion of 1743 for the movement of supply carts and long since superseded by the main service road, kept locked, theoretically. The grounds at this hour were cold and dark and vast in the way that large estates were vast. Not open exactly, but layered, the bare winter trees creating corridors and screens that could swallow a moving figure completely if the figure knew how to use them. She moved along the outer wall of the main building, staying close to the stone, and she was thinking about the name, Aldrich, the chamberlain, the elderly man with the soft voice who had shown her to Rowan's chamber on the wedding night and stepped aside with the practiced discretion of a lifetime of service. She had found his name in the Vareth correspondence not as a signatory, but as a reference. "Your man inside," one of the letters had said. Reliable, long-standing. She had stared at those 2 words for a long time. Long-standing. Aldrich had served the Blackthorne household for 30 years, had served Rowan's father, had served, by all institutional memory, the duchy itself, had apparently been serving someone else the entire time. She reached the east wall. The gate was ahead of her, a narrow iron structure recessed into the stone, and it was closed now. Aldrich had pulled it shut behind him. She stopped 6 feet back and looked at what was beyond it, the outer grounds, the road that ran along the estate's perimeter. The darkness of the tree line past the road. No lanterns. No visible movement. She moved to the wall beside the gate and pressed her back to the stone and listened. Voices. Low. Close enough. She could not make out words. She could make out tone, the specific register of men transacting something, the rhythm of exchange without warmth, the staccato quality of a conversation that both parties wanted finished quickly. She estimated 2 voices. Aldrich was one. The other was unfamiliar. She had no way through the gate without noise. She had no way over the wall. She had, instead, a window of perhaps 3 minutes before the conversation concluded, and Aldrich returned through the gate and found her standing there. And she used those 3 minutes the way she used every resource she had, with the absolute focus of someone who understood that attention was finite and waste was a form of failure. She looked at the gate mechanism. Iron latch, drop bar, no visible padlock, which meant it had been locked from the inside with a bar that could be lifted, which meant Aldrich had either had a key she didn't know about or the lock had been disabled, which meant this was not the first time this gate had been used. She filed that. She looked at the stones around the gate's hinge side. Mortar old, slightly eroded, the kind of surface that held impressions. She looked at the ground in front of the gate, packed earth, the kitchen garden's perimeter path, and there in the faint ambient light from the castle's upper windows, she could see the track marks of regular foot traffic. Not recent. Weeks, at minimum. She filed that too. The voices dropped. She heard movement on the other side. One set of footsteps diminishing, moving away down the road. Then silence. Then the sound of the gate latch lifting from the other side. She was 6 feet down the wall from the gate when it opened, in the deeper shadow between two stone buttresses, absolutely still. Aldrich came through. He was carrying nothing. His face, in the faint light, was the face of a man who had just concluded something he was relieved to have concluded. Not guilty, not afraid, but the specific controlled relief of a professional finishing a task. He latched the gate behind him without looking at it, started back toward the castle. He walked directly past her, 4 feet away. She let him go, watched him move back across the grounds toward the servants' entrance, and she stood in the shadow of the stone buttress and felt the cold come through her coat, and she thought about what she had and what she still needed. What she had: a name confirmed, a gate used for clandestine meetings, evidence of a pattern of access, and the knowledge that whatever information was moving between this castle and House Verith was moving through a man who had been inside the Blackthorne household for 30 years. What she still needed: the content. What was being passed, the timeline, the names of the council members who had been secured and those who were still in play. She needed the next letter before it was sent. She went back inside. She did not sleep. She found the letter 4 days later. She had been methodical about it in the way that she was methodical about everything. Not dramatic, not reckless, but patient and incremental, which was the only approach that worked when you couldn't afford to tip your hand. She had identified Aldrich's routine over the course of a week's observation. The morning dispatch he collected from the estate post office, the specific drawer in the butler's station where he held correspondence before distribution, the window of approximately 40 minutes each morning when he was occupied with the kitchen staff's daily briefing and the station was unattended. She did not take the letter. She read it, memorized what mattered, and put it back. What mattered was considerable. The vote before the Crown's Advisory Council had been moved forward. It was no longer spring. It was now scheduled for the 3rd week of January, 6 weeks away. The coalition had secured 7 of the 12 council members they needed, with 2 more described as pending final confirmation. The mechanism, as she had suspected, was a petition of autonomy review, a rarely invoked but entirely legal process through which the council could mandate an audit of the duchy's governance record, and if that audit returned sufficient irregularities, could recommend to the Crown that the title's independent status be suspended pending restructuring. The irregularities, the letter made clear, would not be difficult to find. Hext's diversion scheme, which she had uncovered and reported, had apparently been only one layer of a larger fraud operation that predated her arrival by years, and the documentation of that fraud, carefully curated and selectively presented, could be made to implicate the ducal administration itself rather than the individual officials who had run it. They were going to use corruption that the duchy had actually suffered to indict the duke for permitting it. She stood in the corridor outside the butler's station for a moment, with the letter back in the drawer and her hand on the wall, and she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: the specific cold fury of watching someone use a real wound as a weapon. The villagers of Turnmouth and the other estates had genuinely been harmed by the corruption she'd spent months dismantling, and now that harm was being harvested, reshaped, aimed. She straightened. She walked away. She had 6 weeks. She started with the 2 pending council members, because they were the edge of the coalition's confidence, and edges were where things could be moved. She wrote letters, careful, specific, unremarkable on their surface, correspondence appropriate to a duchess managing her social calendar, referencing upcoming visits to the capital, expressing interest in connecting with the families of council members whose estates bordered or interacted with the Blackthorne trade routes. She had met both men at the wedding. She remembered everything about those conversations. Lord Prynne's concern about northern grain tariffs, Lord Eswich's younger brother recently appointed to a trade oversight committee. She gave them things they actually wanted, not bribes. She had no interest in that mechanism and no resources to sustain it. She gave them information they could use, connections they'd been trying to make for reasons entirely unrelated to House Vareth's agenda. She positioned herself as a point of access, a useful node in a network they were already part of. She was building something, and she could not tell anyone she was building it, and she had to build it without using Rowan's name or authority, because using his name meant telling him what was happening, and she was not ready for that conversation yet. Not until she had something concrete enough that he couldn't dismiss it, couldn't manage it around her, couldn't take it from her hands and handle it in the way powerful men handled things that had been assembled by women they'd decided didn't exist. She needed it to be complete before she gave it to him. She needed it to be undeniable. She hated that this was her calculation. She was aware, with the clear-eyed honesty she applied to everything, that it was a calculation born from the specific kind of damage his wedding night dismissal had done. That she was working 6 times harder than necessary because she was determined that when she finally handed him the thing that saved his duchy, he would have no possible interpretation of it except the true one. She set that awareness aside. She worked. She was in the library in the second week of December when he found her. Not sought her out, she had learned to distinguish between Rowan moving through the castle with a destination and Rowan moving through the castle with the restless quality of a man running out of useful things to do. This was the latter. He came through the library door without knocking, saw her at the central table surrounded by reference documents and her leather journal and 3 separate ledgers she had cross-referenced across the morning, and stopped. She looked up, looked at him, looked back down. "There's a correspondence from Lord Eswich," he said. "He's requesting a meeting with you in the capital." "I know. I arranged it." A beat. "You arranged a meeting with a Crown Council member. He has interest in the Blackthorne trade route that runs through the Eswich Valley. We have common ground on the tariff structure. It seemed worth pursuing." She turned a page. "I was going to mention it at dinner. You're going to the capital." She looked up again. "Yes. In 2 weeks. I'll need 3 days." He was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when he encountered information he hadn't anticipated. A very slight tightening around the eyes, a quality of attention that sharpened without visibly changing. "You don't need my permission," she added. "I checked." "That's not what I'm—" He stopped, looked at her. "What's in the Eswich meeting?" "What I told you." "That's not an answer." She set down her pen. She looked at him directly across the table, not challenging, not performing composure, just steady, the way she had learned to be steady in rooms where she was not welcome and had decided to stay anyway. "It's the honest answer," she said. "I'm meeting with Lord Eswich about trade routes. If something else comes of it, I'll tell you." "Something else." "I'm not hiding anything from you, Rowan." She used his name deliberately. She watched him register it. "I'm managing a relationship with a council member who has expressed interest in the duchy's economic interests. That seems like something worth managing." A silence. Not comfortable. None of the silences between them were comfortable, but they had different textures, and this one had the texture of a man deciding something. "Fine," he said. He left. She sat at the table for a moment after he was gone. Her hands were flat on the ledger in front of her, and she was looking at the doorway he'd disappeared through, and she was thinking about the specific quality of the way he'd looked at her, not the indifference of their first weeks. Something else. Something she did not have a clean name for and refused to spend time naming. She picked up her pen. She worked. The capital in December was gray and cold and full of the particular energy of political season. The advisory council convening its winter sessions, the noble houses cycling through their rotations of presence and access, the whole elaborate machinery of influence running at full capacity behind a surface of social events and formal dinners. She had 3 days. She used them with the efficiency of someone who understood that time in this city cost something, and that what you spent it on defined what you walked away with. The meeting with Lord Eswich was breakfast on the first morning at his family's townhouse on the North Quarter. He was a careful man. younger than she'd expected up close. Early 40s, something watchful behind the practiced affability of his public face. He poured tea himself rather than waiting for the servant, which meant either he wanted the appearance of informality or he wanted to be certain nothing was overheard in the exchange. She catalogued both possibilities and proceeded as though it were simply courtesy. They talked for an hour about trade routes. She gave him real numbers, real analysis, real options. Not the performance of expertise, but the thing itself, because the thing itself was what she had, and pretending otherwise was a waste of everyone's time. He listened with increasing attention, the kind of attention that shifted from polite to genuine somewhere in the middle of her third point, and by the end of it he was asking follow-up questions that told her exactly where his interests intersected with hers. She left with a commitment that was not yet a promise, but was oriented in the right direction. On the second morning, she met with Lord Prynne's secretary, because Prynne himself was in session, and she spent 40 minutes laying groundwork that would not pay off for weeks, but that was necessary to lay. On the second afternoon, she attended a reception at the home of the Countess Marchfort, whose guest list was the closest thing the capital had to a complete inventory of current political weight, and she moved through it with the same composure she had developed in the Blackthorne estate's social events, present, attentive, giving nothing away, and taking everything in. She heard Verith's name 3 times. Each time she noted the context and the speaker and filed it. It was on the third morning, preparing to return, that she received the note. It was delivered to her rooms at the townhouse she was using, the Blackthorne family's capital residence, small and slightly dated, maintained by a skeleton staff who had clearly not expected the Duchess to require it this year. The note was unsigned. 4 lines. Neat, deliberate handwriting. The vote has been moved again. 14 days. The man in your house already knows. Stop asking questions before they find out you've been asking. She read it 3 times, folded it, put it in her jacket. She thought about who in this city knew enough to send it. She thought about who wanted her to stop and who wanted her to know. She thought about the difference between a warning and a threat, and decided, after careful consideration, that this was both simultaneously, the work of someone with access to both sides of what was happening, someone who had decided she was worth warning and wasn't sure whether that decision would cost them something. 14 days. She had built half of what she needed. She needed the other half in a third of the time she'd planned for. She packed her things. She returned to the Blackthorne estate in a single day's travel rather than the planned 2, arriving after dark, coming through the main entrance to find the castle in the particular restless state of a house whose routines had been disrupted. Aldrich was in the entrance hall. He bowed when he saw her, smooth, practiced, the exact bow of 30 years of service, and she smiled at him pleasantly and handed him her coat and walked past him and thought, "I know what you are." She found Rowan in his study. She knocked. She heard "come in" and opened the door, and he looked up from his desk with the expression of a man expecting someone else. And then his face settled into the version of itself it wore when she was in the room. Not welcoming, not cold exactly, something currently unclassified. "You're back early," he said. "Yes." She came into the room. She stood on the other side of his desk. She looked at him directly. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without interrupting me until I'm finished." Something moved behind his eyes. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." She took a breath. "Someone is building a case against you. A formal petition before the Advisory Council to trigger an autonomy review of the duchy. The vote is now scheduled in 14 days. They have the council members. They have documentation, real documentation, from the Hext operation and others, reframed to implicate you directly rather than the officials who ran it. House Verith is coordinating, and the channel through which information about this castle has been moving to them for at least the past year is Aldrich." Silence. Rowan was very still. The kind of still that was not peace, but its structural opposite, pressure contained. "I've been building a counter," she continued. "I have documentation of the correspondence. I have 2 council members who are persuadable. I have the timeline and the mechanism, and I know which parts of the petition can be dismantled and which parts need to be preempted. But I need another week, and I need access to the estate's full financial archive for the past 3 years. Not the version Fordham maintains. The original ledgers." He had not moved. "Rowan." She kept her voice flat, steady. I need to know you're hearing me. He looked at her across his desk, and she watched something move through his face. Not a single emotion, but a sequence, too fast and too layered to parse in real time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. How long have you known? 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He said it without inflection. You've known for 6 weeks that someone in this house was feeding information out, yes. And you said nothing to me. She held his gaze. I needed to be certain. I needed it to be something you couldn't argue with. You needed... He stopped, stood up, turned away from her and walked to the window, the way he always walked to that window when something had gotten past his defenses, and she watched his hands go to the stone ledge and grip it, and she waited. Aldrich, he said, to the window, to himself. Yes, he's been in this house since before I was born. I know. A long silence. The fire in the study burned steadily. She could hear the distant sound of the castle settling around them, the ordinary sounds of a house that did not know it was standing on the edge of something. When Rowan turned from the window, his face was the face of a man who had just watched the ground shift under 30 years of certainty, and she saw, for the first time since the wedding night, something in his eyes that was not control. It lasted for 3 seconds. Then it was gone, locked back behind whatever architecture he had built for himself over a lifetime of not being allowed to be uncertain in public. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not the assessment of their dinner silences, not the calculation of a man tracking an inconvenient variable, but something rawer, directed, the look of a person realizing mid-sentence that they have been reading the wrong document entirely. The S-Switch meeting, he said, was real, and also useful for this. Prin. Same. He was quiet for a moment. You built a counter-coalition. The beginning of one. It needs more time. You don't have more time, 14 days. I know that. So what do you need from me? It was not the question she had expected. Not, why didn't you come to me sooner? Not, who authorized you to conduct a political operation inside my house? Not the possessive fury she had braced for. Just the question, flat, practical. The voice of a man who had just caught up to the reality she had been living in for 6 weeks and had decided, without theatrics, to operate within it. She almost didn't know what to do with that. She told him what she needed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, The original ledgers are in the East Archive, locked cabinet, second row. I'll give you the key. Tonight, she said. Tonight, he agreed. He opened his desk drawer. He took out a key on a plain iron ring, and he held it out to her across the desk, and she took it, and their fingers did not touch. She was careful about that. But the transfer of the key was the transfer of something else, and they both felt it, and neither of them said so. She turned to leave. Seraphina. She stopped, turned back. He was looking at her with that look again, the 3-second look, the one she didn't have a name for yet. The wedding night, he said. What I said to you. She waited. He stopped, his jaw set. He tried again. That was not now, she said, quietly. No anger in it. There are 14 days and I need every hour of them. We can have that conversation when the duchy is safe. She left before he could say anything else. She walked to the East Archive with the key in her fist, and she told herself the thing in her chest was adrenaline and the pressure of the timeline and the weight of 6 weeks of work arriving at their critical point. She told herself a lot of things in the corridor outside the archive. She unlocked the cabinet. She started pulling ledgers, and she heard, from somewhere on the floor below, the sound of a door closing, and then silence, and then, barely audible, at the edge of perception, the specific quality of footsteps moving with purpose toward the servants' quarter. Aldrich, moving at 11 o'clock at night, an hour outside his established pattern. She looked at the ledgers. She looked at the door. 14 days had just become something smaller, and she felt it. The specific contraction of a window when someone else in the game realizes the board has changed. He knew. She moved fast and she moved quiet, and she did not let herself think about what it meant that Aldrich was awake and moving at 11 o'clock, because thinking about what it meant was a luxury she could not afford until she understood where he was going. The East Archive was on the second floor. She locked it behind her, put the key in her pocket, and took the servant's stair down to the ground level, faster than the main corridor, narrower, and dark enough that she had to keep one hand on the wall. She had learned this staircase in October, coming down it at an odd hour because she had been working late and the kitchen was closer this way, and she had been grateful then for the instinct that made her memorize routes she didn't immediately need. She came out at the base into the corridor that ran behind the kitchen, and she stopped. Aldrich was not in the corridor. She could hear, faintly, from the direction of the staff quarters, a door. Not closing. Already closed, the silence of aftermath. She moved to the staff wing entrance and stopped again, listening. The castle was still around her. Whatever had moved in this corridor had already gone wherever it was going. She thought, he heard something. Something changed tonight, and he knows the board has shifted and he is moving to contain it. And the question is what containing it looks like for a man who has been doing this for 30 years and has never been caught. She thought, the correspondence. If there is outgoing correspondence, it will go tonight. He will not wait. She turned and went to the estate post office, a small room adjacent to the main hall used for sorting all estate mail before dispatch. She had a reason to be there. Her own letters, outgoing, the one she had prepared for Eswich, and 2 other council members, finalized this evening before she'd gone to Rowan. The post room was unlocked. She went in. She lit the single lamp on the sorting table and she looked at the dispatch tray. There were 6 envelopes. 4 were hers. 1 was household correspondence addressed to a supply merchant in the capital, and 1 was addressed in a handwriting she did not recognize to a name she did recognize, a solicitor's firm in the capital that she had seen, twice, in the Verith correspondence as an intermediary address. She stood with that envelope in her hands and she felt the specific sensation of confirmation. Not surprise, because she had known, but the weight of having the thing made physical, made real, made something she could hold. She did not open it. She could not open it without destroying the seal, and destroying the seal would tell him she had found it, and she was not ready for him to know that yet. She put it back. She memorized its position exactly. 3rd from the left, seal side down, the small crease on the upper right corner where it had been placed slightly crooked. She went back to the archive. She pulled ledgers until 2 in the morning, and she found, in the original financial records, 3 additional diversion schemes that Hext's operation had been constructed to obscure, older, cleaner, the work of someone with considerably more patience and considerably more access than a supply controller, the work of a man who had been inside the household for 30 years. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote down every figure, every date, every reference code. She closed the ledgers. She went to her room. She did not sleep. Morning came gray and cold, and she was at Rowan's study door by 7. He was already at his desk. He looked like he hadn't slept either, which told her something she didn't try to interpret. She came in without preamble and put her notes on his desk and said, Aldrich sent correspondence last night. I found the envelope in the dispatch tray. It goes to a solicitor's firm the Verith Coalition uses as a relay. I didn't open it. I need to know if you want to intercept it before it leaves with the Morning Post, or let it go and use the sending as documentation. He looked at the notes, looked at her. Let it go, he said. We need the sending on record. That's what I thought. What else? The original ledgers have 3 additional diversion schemes. Older than Hext, more sophisticated. They go back 11 years. She paused. Aldrich's been building this for a long time. The silence in the study was the kind that had mass. Rowan picked up the first page of her notes. His face was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when control is the only thing standing between a man and something that would unmake him if he let it. She watched him read, and she thought about what it must feel like to read the documented proof that a man you had trusted since childhood, since before your father died, since before you understood what trust actually cost, had been a different person the entire time. She didn't say anything about that. There was nothing to say. The council vote, he said. 14 days. Closer to 12 now. I lose time if I can't get back to the capital before the week is out. What do you still need? Eswich needs 1 more meeting. Prynne I can do by correspondence. There are two other members whose positions I haven't been able to determine, Counselors Fenn and Darrow. I don't have a read on them. Fenn is Vareth's, Rowan said immediately. Has been for years. Don't spend time there. She filed that. Darrow? Darrow is cautious. He doesn't move until he knows which way the majority is going. He set down the notes. If you can show him the vote is winnable without Vareth's coalition, he'll move to the winning side. Then I need to be able to show him numbers he'll believe. I'll write to him directly. A duke's letter carries more weight than a duchess's with Darrow. He's old school about that. He said it without apology, but also without satisfaction. Just the tactical assessment of a man who had accepted that the world was built a certain way and had learned to use the construction. She accepted it the same way. Do that today. Done. He looked at her again. You need to leave tomorrow. Yes. I'll have the carriage prepared. You'll take 2 guards instead of 1. She started to say she didn't need 2 guards, and then she stopped, because she thought about the envelope in the dispatch tray, and the note she'd received in the capital, and the fact that the timeline had just compressed sharply, and she said, "All right." She turned to go. "The ledger documentation," he said. "Leave me copies." She put the copies on his desk. She left. Osal. She was packed and in the courtyard by 8 the following morning, and it was there, in the gray winter light with the carriage being brought around and the 2 guards waiting by the horses, that everything she had built came apart. The man who walked through the main gate was not someone she recognized. He was well-dressed, middle-aged, carrying a document case, and moving with the specific unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly how much authority they're carrying and has no need to announce it. Behind him came 2 others in the dark coats of Crown administrative officers. She stood in the courtyard and watched them come, and felt the first cold finger of it. Not panic, she didn't panic, but the precursor to understanding, the specific sensation of a pattern assembling in real time into something she didn't want it to be. The man with the document case stopped in the courtyard, looked at her. His expression was professionally neutral. "Lady Blackthorne," he said. "I'm here to see the Duke. Is he available?" "Who are you?" she said. "Assessor Graves. Crown Advisory Council, Governance Division." He said it pleasantly. The way you said something when the power behind it made pleasantness a kind of weight. "I believe the Duke is expecting this visit." She did not move. "He didn't mention it to me." "Perhaps you could let him know we're here." She looked at the 2 officers behind him. She looked at the document case. She thought about 14 days becoming 12 and 12, becoming whatever this was, and she said, "Wait here," and she went inside. She found Rowan at the top of the main stair. He was already moving toward her, which meant he'd seen the gate from his study window, and his face told her what she already suspected. "You knew they were coming," she said. "I received word this morning, before you came down." His voice was flat. "The petition was filed yesterday. Graves is here to begin the preliminary audit." Yesterday. She absorbed that. Aldrich's letter. Moved fast. The timeline moved up again. They're not waiting for the council vote. They're starting the audit process now. If the audit returns findings before the vote, the council's decision is effectively predetermined. I know. How long does the preliminary audit take? 3 days minimum, typically 5. We don't have 5 days. She looked at him. The correspondence I found, the ledger evidence, I need to get that to Eswich and Prynne before Graves finishes his preliminary. If they can file a counter-petition with the council before the audit report is submitted, it creates a procedural conflict that delays everything by at least 2 weeks. You need to get to the capital today. I need to get to the capital right now. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, but not the unclassifiable look from the night before, something sharper, something that felt like a man realizing the gap between what he understood and what was actually happening. Go, he said. I'll manage Graves. She was moving before he finished. But she did not make it to the capital. She made it 6 miles down the southern road before the carriage stopped, and when she pushed the door open to ask why, she found one of her 2 guards unconscious in the road and the other one gone, and 3 men on horseback blocking the way forward with the specific patience of people who had been waiting. She sat in the open carriage door and looked at them, and the cold morning air hit her face, and she thought, with extraordinary clarity, of course. The man in the center was not wearing House Vareth's colors. He wasn't wearing anything that identified him. But she knew what this was, the same way you knew what a locked door meant when it locked from the outside. "Lady Blackthorne," he said, you need to come with us." "I don't," she said. "That wasn't a request." She looked at the unconscious guard in the road. She looked at the 3 horses. She looked at the document case in her hand, copies of the ledger evidence, the correspondence documentation, everything she had spent 6 weeks building. She thought about what happened if she fought this and lost. She thought about what happened if she went with them. She thought about what Rowan was managing back at the castle, alone, with Assessor Graves going through the estate records without the counter-evidence she had been about to deliver. She stepped down from the carriage. She let them take her. Not because she was afraid. Fear was useful information, and she was receiving it clearly, but it was not operating her. She let them take her because fighting 3 mounted men with no weapons and no backup was not survival. It was theater, and she had no interest in theater. She let them take her because she had one thing they didn't know about: a copy of the most critical documents, small enough to fold, currently inside the lining of her coat, where she had put it the night before out of the same instinct that made her memorize staircases she didn't immediately need. They blindfolded her. She counted turns. Yup. The room they put her in was not a prison cell. It was too well appointed for that. A small sitting room, decent furniture, a fire already lit, which meant they had prepared for her arrival, which meant someone with access to the estate had known she was leaving this morning and at what hour. She sat down. She thought about who had known. Rowan, the housekeeper who had arranged the carriage, the 2 guards, one of whom was now unconscious in the road and one of whom was not accounted for, and Aldrich, who managed the castle's daily operations and who would have seen the carriage order come through as a matter of routine. Aldrich. Still, after everything. An hour passed, maybe 90 minutes. She was counting by the fire's burn rate. Then the door opened and a man came in who was not one of the 3 from the road. He was older, well-dressed, carrying himself with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in the room. She knew his face. She had seen it at the wedding, at the December banquet, across a dozen social occasions in which she had smiled pleasantly and catalogued everything. Lord Vareth himself. He sat in the chair across from her without asking permission, which told her this was his house, or close enough to it. He looked at her with the evaluating attention of a man who had been told something about her and was now updating the information against the actual article. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been managing my responsibilities," she said, "as the Duke requested." "The Duke?" He said it with a particular inflection, not contempt, something more precise. "Does the Duke know what his responsibilities include, do you think?" "He's learning." Vareth was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to be straightforward with you, Lady Blackthorne. I have no interest in harming you. You've done nothing to House Vareth. What you've done is complicate a process that was operating cleanly before you started asking questions in the estate archive." "I was reading accounts," she said. "That's generally considered within the remit of estate management." "Don't do that," he said. "Not angry, just tired, in the way of a man who has been in this business too long to find cleverness charming. You know what you found. You know what you've been building, and you're smart enough to know that what you've built is not yet enough." He leaned forward slightly. "The audit has begun. Graves will find what he's been directed to find. The council vote, when it occurs, will return the outcome we've prepared for. The Duke's title is not in mortal danger. He'll retain it in an advisory capacity under the coalition's governance framework. He simply won't have the independence he currently enjoys. And you'd like me to stop?" "I'd like you to consider," he said, "what you're actually fighting for. A man who told you on your wedding night that you didn't exist to him. A duchy that was never offered to you, that you simply decided to claim." He paused. "We can make that easier. Stand down. Let the process conclude. Your position as Duchess is untouched. Your life here continues. We have no quarrel with you." She looked at him. She thought about the wedding night. She thought about the dining room with the 12-seat table and the candles and the silence that had been their operating language for months. She thought about the key on the plain iron ring that he had held out to her across his desk, the transfer of trust from a man who did not give trust easily, who had spent his whole life keeping it locked behind architecture so solid it had become architecture of himself. She thought about the look on his face when she had said Aldrich's name. She said, "No." Vareth looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not surprise, closer to reassessment. "You understand what you're refusing." "I understand exactly what I'm refusing," she said. "And I understand what you're offering. You're offering me comfort in a cage, a title without meaning in a duchy that's been stripped of the capacity to act. You're offering me exactly what my husband offered me on our wedding night, and you're expecting me to take it because I'm supposed to be grateful for whatever partial thing powerful men decide to hand me." She held his gaze. "I've been refusing that offer for months. I'm not going to start accepting it now." Silence. The fire burned. Vareth looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalculating something significant. "You're in no position to negotiate," he said finally. "I'm not negotiating," she said. "I'm answering your question." He stood. He went to the door. Before he opened it, he turned back and looked at her with something that might, in a different context, have been respect. "You're going to be here for a few days," he said. "Think carefully about how you'd like them to go." He left. The door locked. She sat in the chair and the fire burned, and she was very still for a moment, just breathing, letting the last hour settle into something she could work with. Then she reached into the lining of her coat and extracted the folded documents and looked at them for a moment, thinking about how much they mattered and how little they mattered while she was in this room. And she thought about Rowan in the castle with Graves going through the estate records, and no counter-evidence, and no duchess, and a timeline that had just become something she could not calculate from inside a sitting room 6 miles from home. She thought, he is going to walk into the trap. He is going to be standing in his own study watching Graves document every piece of evidence the coalition curated for exactly this moment, and he is going to have no idea what I know or where I am. She thought, the copy. Someone needs the copy. She thought about the unconscious guard in the road. She thought about the missing guard, the one who had simply not been there when she opened the carriage door, the one who had disappeared before the 3 riders appeared. And she thought, with the cold, specific clarity of someone whose anger had just finished converting itself into something useful, he wasn't taken. He left, which meant he had known, which meant this was not simply Aldrich's letter from 2 nights ago bearing fruit. This was layered, prepared, the product of someone inside the castle who had known her movements for longer than 1 night. The missing guard's name was Terrace. She had been assigned him 3 weeks ago by the castle's head of security, a man named Colworth, at Rowan's direction. She sat with that. Then she stood up and went to the room's single window and looked at what was outside. A courtyard, a wall, the edge of tree line beyond it. And she began to think about the window's latch, and the distance to the courtyard floor, and the direction of the tree line relative to the road she had counted turns on. And she thought, I have perhaps 1 night before they realize I am not going to change my answer, and 1 night is enough if I use it correctly. She had built everything she had from nothing, in a house where no one had invited her to build it. A locked room and a single window was, comparatively, a generous set of resources. She would not be here in the morning, but the castle she returned to would not be the one she had left, and the man standing in it would be a man she did not yet know how to reach. And the document in her coat would mean nothing if she arrived too late. She tested the window latch. Cold iron. Old. She pressed, and it gave. The window latch gave on the second press, and she held it still, listening, because a latch that moved also made sound, and sound in a quiet house at this hour was information traveling in the wrong direction. Nothing. The courtyard below was empty. She looked at the drop. 12 feet, maybe 14. Stone flags at the bottom, with a narrow strip of frozen mud along the wall's base. She looked at the tree line past the wall. She looked at her coat, her boots, the documents folded inside the lining, and she made the calculation that people made when the options were bad and worse, and the clock was the only thing that didn't wait. She went feet first. She dropped. The landing hit her left ankle like a hammer, and she went down on 1 knee on the frozen stone and stayed there for 3 seconds, with her teeth locked and her breath coming in controlled pulls through her nose. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because sound was still the enemy. Then she stood. The ankle held. She moved to the wall. The wall was old-dressed stone with enough erosion in the mortar joints to get fingers into. She had climbed worse as a child, scaling the garden walls of her father's estate in the particular way of children who have been told not to and have decided the instruction is advisory. She went up in under a minute and dropped into the mud on the far side and moved immediately into the tree line before she stopped to think about which direction was east. She counted. She had been blindfolded for roughly 40 minutes in the carriage. Vareth's people had not driven fast. They were confident, not urgent. At moderate pace, 40 minutes on the southern road from the estate put her somewhere between 4 and 7 miles out. The road would be watched. The tree line ran roughly parallel to it, and if she stayed in the trees and moved fast, she could make distance without being visible from the road. Her ankle was swelling inside her boot. She noted this and moved. She came out of the tree line onto the estate's southern perimeter road just before midnight, covered in mud to the knee, her breath coming in visible clouds in the cold air. She had been moving for over 3 hours, longer than the distance required because she had doubled back twice when she heard horses on the road, and her ankle was now a constant low fire that required active management, meaning she could not afford to think about it directly because thinking about it directly would slow her down, so she kept it in her peripheral attention and focused on the road ahead. The estate's south gate was locked at night. She knew this. She also knew the groundskeeper's hut was 40 yards east of the gate, and that the groundskeeper, a man named betrayal, who had worked the estate for 20 years and had come to her in October about the broken drainage in the east garden, kept a duplicate key on a hook inside his door. She knocked. It took 3 knocks before a lamp came on inside. betrayal opened the door in his work clothes. He slept in them, she realized, or had simply not gone to bed yet, and looked at her standing in the dark covered in mud and said nothing for a long moment. "Lady Blackthorne," he said. "I need the south gate key," she said, "and I need you to forget I was here." He looked at her. He looked at her ankle, which she had not mentioned but which was visible in the way that injuries are visible when a person is trying hard not to favor a leg. He went inside and came back with the key and a strip of cloth, and he said, "Wrap it before you walk further on it." And she took both things and said thank you, and meant it in the way you meant things when someone gave you exactly what you needed with no questions attached. She wrapped the ankle against the boot. She let herself through the south gate. She crossed the kitchen gardens in the dark, moving on memory and the faint ambient light from the castle's upper windows. And she went in through the kitchen entrance and up the servants' stair, and she was in the main corridor of the east wing before she understood from the quality of the noise, too much of it, too many voices at this hour, that something had already broken. She heard Rowan's voice before she saw him. Not raised. Something worse than raised. The specific controlled register of a man who has decided to be very precise about what he says because precision is the only weapon left. She followed the sound to the entrance hall. Assessor Graves was still there. It was nearly midnight, and Graves was still in the entrance hall with his document case and his 2 crown officers. And standing opposite him was Rowan in his evening coat with 3 members of the estate staff behind him, and the specific stillness of a man who has been managing a confrontation for hours and is not yet lost but is running low on the particular resource that allows you to keep managing without breaking. Aldrich was not in the hall. She noted that immediately. She walked in. Every head turned. Graves looked at her with the neutral professional expression of a man recalibrating. Rowan looked at her with something that moved too fast across his face for her to catch. She saw the start of it, the specific flinch of a man who has been told something about where someone he expected to rely on has been. And she saw it get locked away in under a second, and what replaced it was something harder and colder and absolutely present. "Lady Blackthorne," Graves said, "I was informed you'd left the estate this morning." "I came back," she said. She looked at Rowan. She reached into her coat and took out the folded documents, and she held them across the space between them and said, "I need you to look at these, right now." He crossed the hall in 4 steps and took the documents, and she watched him read, and she watched his face do the thing faces did when information arrived that restructured everything. Not collapse, not shock, something more controlled than either, the rapid interior reorganization of a man absorbing a new map in real time. He looked up. He looked at Graves. "I'd like to postpone the remainder of this audit," he said, "until the morning." "That's not possible," Graves said. "The council's directive is going to be contested." Rowan's voice was very quiet. "The petition that triggered this audit was filed using documentation obtained through a compromised channel inside this estate. I have evidence of that. You're going to want to look at it before you submit your preliminary report, Assessor, because if your report is built on contaminated documentation and that comes out at the council level, it's not the duchy's governance that gets reviewed." Graves was quiet for a long moment. "Morning," he said. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, Rowan agreed. Graves and his officers withdrew to the guest quarters they had been given. The entrance hall emptied down to the two of them and the 3 staff members, and Rowan dismissed the staff with a word and then turned to her and looked at her. Really looked at her. The full version, the one she had seen twice before, and this time it landed somewhere different because she was standing in mud-soaked boots with a wrapped ankle and 3 hours of winter tree line behind her, and she was too tired to manage what she did with it. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Ankle. It's manageable." "What happened?" She told him. She kept it tight and chronological, and she did not editorialize, because there was no time for editorializing, and she was not sure she could manage it anyway. And when she got to the part about Vareth's offer and her refusal, she kept her voice exactly level, and she watched something move through Rowan's jaw. A tightening, brief, controlled. And she kept going. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "Terrace. The missing guard, yes. I think he was the internal source for the carriage timing. Not Aldrich for this one. Someone younger, someone Colworth's office placed." "Colworth placed him 3 weeks ago." "I know. Colworth has been with this estate for 12 years. "I know that too." She met his eyes. "Someone turned him. Or he was already. I can't tell you which without more time, and we don't have more time. Graves is here. Aldrich is somewhere in this castle, and he knows the board has shifted, and Vareth's people are going to realize I'm gone by morning." He absorbed this. She could see him processing it the way he processed everything. Not linearly, the way most people did, but in parallel, running contingencies simultaneously, the particular intelligence of a man who had been surviving political complexity since childhood because he had never had the option of not surviving it. "Aldrich," he said, "we need to find him before he finds another way out." Rowan turned. He spoke 2 words to the air, and from the side corridor came 2 men she hadn't noticed. Castle guards, off the regular rotation, the kind of quiet placement that meant he had been thinking about this for hours before she arrived. "East wing first," he said. "Kitchen, archive, service corridors. He won't go for the main gate." "South gate's locked," she said. "I have Briel's key." Something crossed his face at that. He didn't say anything about it. They moved. They found Aldrich in the East Archive. He was at the cabinet she had worked from the night before, and he had the original ledgers, 3 of them, pulled out, stacked beside what she recognized as a leather satchel of the kind used for document transport. He was moving efficiently and without visible panic, the way professionals moved when executing a plan that had contingencies, and he did not hear them until Rowan said his name from the doorway. He stopped. He turned around. The man who had served the Blackthorne household for 30 years looked at the man he had served and the woman he had underestimated, and his face did not collapse and it did not perform innocence. It did something more disturbing. It settled. The way a surface settles when the pretense beneath it finally stops being necessary. "Put the ledgers down," Rowan said. Aldrich set them down on the cabinet. He stood straight. He had the specific bearing of a man who had decided how this was going to go and had made his peace with it. "How long?" Rowan said. 11 years, Aldrich said, "since the year after your father died." The archive was very quiet. "My father," Rowan said. The words were flat, stripped of everything. "Your father was going to restructure the household, reduce certain arrangements that had become comfortable." Aldrich's voice was even, professional, the voice of a man explaining a business decision. "Lord Vareth offered stability, continuation, in exchange for certain information made available on an ongoing basis." 11 years, Rowan said again, not a question, processing something that had no bottom to it. "The duchy would have faced this review eventually regardless," Aldrich said. He was looking at Rowan directly, not at Seraphina. She understood why. She was the variable he hadn't adequately planned for, and looking at her would require acknowledging that. The governance irregularities were real. They existed before Lady Blackthorne arrived, and they would have accumulated regardless. "You built them," Seraphina said. "The Hext operation, the 3 earlier schemes. You built the paper trail that Vareth is using as the basis for the audit petition. You created the irregularities you're now describing as inevitable." Aldrich looked at her. For the first time, something shifted behind his expression. Not guilt, something more complicated. The look of a man who has had a long time to make peace with what he is, and is finding the peace less complete than expected. "The Duchess has been thorough," he said. "Stop talking to her like that," Rowan said. The quiet in the room changed texture. Aldrich looked back at Rowan, and whatever he saw there made him close his mouth. Rowan crossed the archive to the cabinet. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the satchel. He looked at the man who had shown a 23-year-old duke how to manage his first household meetings, who had known his name before he could write it himself, who had stood in the entrance hall of this castle for 3 decades and bowed to every member of this family with the smooth, practiced fidelity of a man who had simply chosen, one day, to be 2 things at once. "Get him out of here," Rowan said, to the guards, not to Aldrich. "Lock him in the west room. Nobody talks to him until morning." The guards moved. Aldrich went without resistance. At the doorway he stopped. The guards let him. They shouldn't have, but something in the quality of the moment made everyone pause. And he looked back at Rowan one time. He did not say anything. Whatever he was looking for in Rowan's face, he either found it or accepted he wouldn't, and then he was gone. And the archive was empty except for the 2 of them and the ledgers and the satchel and the fire burning low in the grate. Rowan stood at the cabinet with his back to her for a long time. She let him. She sat down in the chair at the reading table because her ankle needed her weight off it, and she was tired in the way that came after the specific adrenaline of 3 hours of sustained crisis. And she looked at the fire, and she let the silence be what it needed to be. "He knew my father," Rowan said finally, still to the cabinet. "Yes. He was at the funeral. He managed the household through the transition. He stopped. I trusted him the way you trust furniture, the way you trust the walls." His voice was not breaking. Something worse. It was exactly steady, in the way that things were exactly steady right before the structure failed. "I didn't even think about trusting him. He was just there." She said nothing. This was not a moment for saying things. He turned around. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And she thought about what 11 years of certainty felt like when it dissolved in a single evening. And she thought about the wedding night, and she thought about the key on the plain iron ring. And she thought about a man who had built every defense he possessed against the specific variety of damage that came from being wrong about who was worth trusting, and who had been wrong anyway, not about a stranger, but about the furniture, the walls, the architecture of his own life. "We still have graves at 7, she said. "I know. The documentation I brought back, with what you pulled from the ledgers tonight, we have enough to demonstrate the audit petition is built on manufactured evidence. It won't be clean. Graves will push back. But it creates enough procedural conflict to delay the council vote. And if Eswich and Prynne move, they'll move," Rowan said. "I spoke to Darrow this afternoon. He's with us." She looked at him. "You got Darrow?" "He's old school. He responds to dukes." Something moved across his face. Not quite what she would have called humor, but adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man surprised to find something functional in himself at a moment when he expected to find nothing. "I have some uses." She almost smiled. She caught it. 7 o'clock, she said. 7 o'clock. He looked at her for a moment. "Your ankle." "I said it was manageable." "I heard you." He moved to the archive's side table, where someone had left a cloth, probably used for dusting the reference materials. And he crouched in front of her chair without ceremony, and she was so surprised by the movement that she didn't say anything while he unwrapped the groundskeeper's cloth from her boot, and looked at the swelling with the impersonal, focused attention he applied to everything that needed assessing. "It's not broken," he said. "I know. I walked 3 miles on it." "That's not the point." He rewrapped it, tighter, more effective, the rap of someone who knew what he was doing. He stood. He did not step back immediately. He was very close, and she was sitting and he was standing, and the distance between them was shorter than it had been since their one obligatory wedding dance. And she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and she felt the specific weight of everything that was not being said pressing on the air between them. He stepped back. He picked up the ledgers. "Get some sleep," he said. 2 hours minimum. I need you functional at 7. "Rowan?" He stopped. She had not planned what she was going to say. She had learned over these months to plan everything, to move from prepared position to prepared position, to never extend toward him without knowing where the ground was. She was tired and her ankle hurt, and she had been held in a room by the most powerful political force working against this duchy, and had walked out of it alone in the dark, and she was out of the energy she used for planning. "Thank you," she said, "for the letter to Darrow." He looked at her. The thing in his eyes was back. The 3-second thing, the one she had never successfully named, and this time it lasted longer than 3 seconds. "Get some sleep," he said again. "Quieter." He left. She sat in the archive with the dying fire and the remaining ledger, and she let herself have 3 minutes. 3 minutes of not managing it, not filing it away, not converting it into something functional. 3 minutes of acknowledging that she was 23 years old and she had spent 6 weeks building a counter-operation inside an enemy's house while simultaneously learning an estate and saving 3 villages and managing the specific loneliness of doing all of it without being allowed to ask for anything, and that she was tired in a way that sleep would not entirely fix. Then the 3 minutes were over. She stood. She picked up the ledger. She was halfway to the door when she heard it. From outside, from the direction of the main gate, the sound that a large group of horses made when they arrived without announcement in the middle of the night. Not 2 or 3. More than that. She went to the archive window. She looked out at the front approach. Torchlight. Moving. A column of riders coming up the main road. And at the front of it, visible even at this distance by the particular way power arranged itself in space around him, a figure she recognized. Vareth had not waited for morning. She had the ledger. She had the documents. She had Rowan somewhere in this castle, and Graves in the guest quarters, and Aldrich locked in the west room, and an ankle that was going to make running a complicated proposition, and coming up the front road of the Blackthorne estate in the middle of the night was the man who had sat across from her in a comfortable chair and offered her a cage and had now apparently decided that her refusal required a different approach. She did not run. She stood at the window and counted the torches and did the arithmetic of what was coming. And she thought about what Vareth's arrival meant for the audit, for Graves, for the morning meeting, for every piece of the structure she and Rowan had spent the last 6 hours assembling. She thought, he is going to bypass Graves entirely. He is not here for the audit. The audit was the polite version. This is what comes after the polite version fails. She moved. She went for Rowan. She hit the corridor at speed, and she did not favor the ankle because there was no longer time for that. And she came around the east wing corner and found him, already in the corridor, already moving toward her, because he had heard it too, and his face in the corridor's lamplight was the face of a man who had run out of the specific patience he'd been using to manage this evening and had replaced it with something rawer and older and considerably more dangerous. They stopped 2 feet apart. "How many?" he said. 20 riders, minimum. His jaw set. He's here to take the audit documentation. If Graves hands it over voluntarily under direct pressure from a council coalition leader, then the preliminary report reflects whatever Vareth wants it to reflect, and we have nothing. She held up the ledger. This is what he's actually here for. If we can get this and the document copies to Graves before Vareth reaches him, Graves is in the east guest suite. Vareth goes to the main entrance first. He looked at her. The calculation was already done in his eyes. You go to Graves, through the back corridor, servant's entrance to the east guest wing, now. And you? I'm going to the main entrance. Rowan. He came with 20 riders. I know. He looked at her, and the look was direct and undefended in a way she had never seen on him before. Not the 3-second look, not the measuring look, not any of the looks she had catalogued across months of parallel existence. Something fundamental. The look of a man who had run out of everything except the truth of what he was willing to do. Go. Get to Graves. The documentation alone won't be enough if Seraphina, her name in his mouth, his real voice, no distance in it. Go. She went. She was running down the back corridor when she heard, from the direction of the main entrance, the sound of the great doors opening. Rowan's voice, carrying clearly even at this distance, cutting through the cold night air with the particular register of a man speaking on his own ground to someone who has arrived without invitation. And then underneath it, Vareth's voice in response. And then the sound, sudden and wrong, of something that was not a voice at all. She stopped. She turned. The sound came again. The specific crack of immediate violence, close, inside the building, not outside, which meant someone had already come through a secondary entrance, which meant the 20 riders at the front were not the only approach, which meant she had miscounted, and they had planned for the possibility that she would warn him, and she was already running back. She came around the corridor corner, and the scene in the entrance hall resolved in fragments. 2 men she didn't know, the far doorway, and Rowan. Rowan with his back against the wall and his hand on his side, and something wrong with the angle of his body, the specific wrongness of a person managing damage. And in his other hand, the document case he had taken from somewhere, the one with the full audit documentation that Graves had brought. And he was holding it behind him against the wall as though the question of whether it stayed in his hands was worth whatever was currently happening to his side. She did not stop to think. She crossed the hall. The closer of the 2 men turned toward her, and she hit him with the ledger, a large volume, dense, the full weight of 3 years of original estate financial records, directly across the side of his head, and he went sideways into the doorframe, and she was already past him, at Rowan's side, her hand going to his arm. "The document case," she said. "Give it to me." "Go to Graves." "Give it to me." She took it. She looked at his side where his hand was pressed, and she looked at what was on his hand, and the cold moved through her in a single clean wave. "How bad?" "Manageable," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. In another context, from the mouth of another person, she might have recognized those as her own words. She thought she saw it register in his eyes, too, the specific recognition of something coming full circle. "There are more of them in the building," he said. "Seraphina, Graves." She tightened her grip on the document case. She looked at the second man, still between her and the back corridor, now turning toward them. She looked at Rowan. He straightened off the wall. Both hands now. One still on his side, one free. And his face was the face of a man making a decision that he understood might be the last one he made in a comfortable position. And he looked at her with something she had no more time to name than she'd ever had before. And he said, "Stay behind me." And he moved. He moved, and she stayed close, and the entrance hall became the kind of place that happens when people with nothing left to lose finally stop performing restraint. The second man came fast, and Rowan met him without hesitation. Not with the controlled deliberateness of someone fighting from a position of strength, but with the specific economical brutality of someone who has accepted that this is going to cost something and has decided the cost is worth paying. She watched him take a hit to the shoulder he was already favoring and not stop, not slow, and she understood in that moment something about him she had been circling for months without landing on directly. That what looked like coldness from the outside was not coldness at all. It was compression. Everything he felt had always been there, running at pressure, and he had built the architecture to contain it because the alternative was being destroyed by it. She had thought he felt nothing. He felt everything. He had simply never been given a reason to let it out where anyone could see. She moved left. The first man had recovered from the ledger and was coming back, and she put the document case behind her against the wall and used both hands and the corner of the entrance hall's heavy side table. And she was not elegant about it, and she did not need to be. She needed him down long enough for Rowan to finish what he was doing, and she got it, and she got a cut across her palm in the process that she noted and did not address. Then it was quiet. 2 men on the floor. Rowan against the far wall with his hand back on his side and his breathing audible. Controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing pain through sheer mechanical will. She crossed to him. She looked at what was under his hand. "It needs pressure and it needs a physician," she said. "In that order," he agreed. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we go to Graves first." Right now, before Vareth reaches the guest wing. She picked up the document case. She looked at him. Rowan, can you actually walk? I said yes. He pushed off the wall. He walked. She stayed at his left side, close enough to catch him if the walk became something else, and they moved through the castle together in the specific silence of two people who have just come through something and have not yet had time to understand what it means. But Assessor Graves opened his door in a dressing gown with the expression of a man whose night had already exceeded his professional expectations by a significant margin, and he looked at the Duke of Blackthorne bleeding through his evening coat and the Duchess of Blackthorne holding a document case and a ledger with a cut hand, and he said with remarkable composure, "Come in." She put the documents on his table. She put the ledger beside them. She stood across from him while Rowan sat in the room's single chair because she had put him in it by means of a look that did not invite argument, and she talked for 20 minutes without stopping. She laid it out completely. The Vareth correspondence, the manufactured audit trail, Aldrich's 11-year operation, the 2 council members they had secured in Darrow's position, the riders currently somewhere in the castle and what their presence meant for the legitimacy of this audit. She spoke with the flat precision of someone presenting a case, not telling a story, and Graves listened with the focused attention of a man recalibrating his entire professional situation in real time. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the documents. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Rowan, who had not spoken, and whose face had the particular gray quality of someone spending considerable internal resources on staying upright. If what you're presenting is accurate, Graves said carefully, the petition is compromised from its origin point. It is accurate, she said, and you'll be able to verify every piece of it independently. I've cross-referenced the ledger evidence against 3 separate estate records. The correspondence carries Vareth's relay address. The same one appears in the duchy's intercepted mail records from 6 weeks ago. She paused. What I need from you is a procedural stay on the preliminary report. 24 hours. Long enough for me to reach Eswich and Prynne and file the counterpetition. Graves looked at his documents. Looked at her. The rider's outside, he said. Lord Vareth is here personally. Yes. And you're asking me to hold my report against direct pressure from a coalition council leader. I'm asking you, she said, to do your job, which is to assess governance accurately, not to deliver the outcome someone paid for. A silence. The fire in Graves's room burned steadily. Somewhere in the castle, below them, she could hear voices. The specific quality of Vareth's entry, the controlled commotion of 20 riders arriving with intention. Graves closed the document case. He put his hand on it. 24 hours, he said. I'll need everything copied and signed. I'll have it ready by dawn, she said. She looked at Rowan. He was looking at her with the gray face and the hand on his side and the look, the one she had never named, and this time it was too tired and too unguarded to be anything except what it actually was, and she held it for a moment and then she said to Graves, He needs a physician. Is there anything in your supply case? There was. Graves was, it turned out, methodical about field preparations in the way of men who had done this work long enough to know that audits in contested territories occasionally produced situations that exceeded paperwork. He had bandaging and a bottle of something that smelled like it would do the job it needed to do. And Seraphina sat on the edge of Graves's bed and wrapped Rowan's side with the same focused impersonal attention he had applied to her ankle in the archive. And neither of them said anything, and the wound was serious but not critical, and his breathing steadied as the pressure held. He looked down at her hands working. He looked at the cut across her palm. That needs cleaning, he said. Later, she said. Seraphina. She looked up. His face was very close. She was sitting and he was in the chair, and the distance between them was shorter than it had ever been outside of a ballroom, shorter than it had been on the wedding night when she had walked across a room toward a beginning that wasn't one. His eyes were dark and exhausted and completely without armor. I know, she said. Later. She tied off the bandage. She stood. She went to Graves's table and she started copying documents by lamplight because there was still work to do and dawn was 4 hours away and she had a counterpetition to build. Vareth did not reach Graves that night. Whether it was the castle's layout, the guards Rowan had positioned, or the simple arithmetic of a man who had arrived to find the situation more complicated than his intelligence suggested? She never knew exactly. What she knew was that by the time the first gray light came through Graves's window, she had every document signed and cross-referenced, and Rowan was asleep in the chair with his head against the wall in the specific graceless posture of a man who had finally run out of the will to stay awake, and she looked at him for a long moment before she woke him, because she needed to remember what he looked like when the architecture was down, like someone who had been tired for a very long time and had forgotten it was possible to stop. She woke him. They moved. The counterpetition reached the Crown Advisory Council 3 days later, carried by a courier who left before dawn on the morning after the longest night, while Seraphina was in a second carriage behind him, properly guarded this time, 4 men she had selected herself from the castle's roster, heading for the capital at a pace that left her ankle aching and her mind running so far ahead of her body that she barely felt the road. She met with Eswich at 7 in the morning in his private office, not the breakfast room. He read what she gave him without speaking for 20 minutes. Then he looked up and said, "This is complete." "Yes," she said. "You built this in 6 weeks." "7," she said. "I started the night I found the first letter." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had seen on several faces over the past months, the recalibration, the adjustment of a prior assessment against new information. Then he said, "I'll file this morning. Prynne will co-sign within the hour." She was back in the carriage by 8. She was at the duchy's border by nightfall. She was home by midnight. The Crown's response came 12 days later. The audit was suspended pending investigation of the petition's claims. Assessor Graves's preliminary report, which he had held with the exact professional integrity she had asked him for, was accepted as the official record of the duchy's governance status. 2 members of the Verith coalition withdrew from the council vote citing conflicts of interest, which was a phrase that meant Eswich and Prynne's counter-petition had made the cost of staying in too high. The vote, when it finally occurred, returned a result that left the Blackthorne duchy's autonomy intact. Lord Verith was not charged with anything. Men like Verith were rarely charged with anything. What happened to him was something quieter and more lasting. The specific kind of political diminishment that occurs when an operation fails visibly, when the carefully constructed mechanism is exposed and examined, when the people who are going to benefit from it calculate the risk of continued association and find it unfavorable. She watched it happen from a distance, through correspondence and the reports that came through estate channels, and she did not feel triumphant about it. Triumph was for people who had wanted a war. She had wanted a duchy that could function. That was what she had. Aldrich was turned over to the Crown's administrative authority and removed from the estate. She was present when they took him. She made herself be present because bearing witness to difficult things was, she had decided, part of the accounting she owed herself. He looked at her when they led him past. She looked back. She did not say anything, and neither did he, and the silence was not comfortable, and it was not peaceful, and she did not need it to be either of those things. What it was honest, and honest was enough. The change in Rowan was not sudden, and it was not dramatic, and it was not announced. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the Crown's response, when she looked up from the estate accounts she was reviewing in the library and found him in the doorway. Not with purpose, not with documents, not with the practical forward momentum that constituted most of his movements through this castle, just standing there in a way that was new, that she did not have a prior category for. "The Turnmouth harvest numbers came in," he said. "I saw. Good return. Gareth sent a letter, to you specifically." He held it up. "Addressed to the Duchess, not the estate office." She said nothing. She waited. He came into the library. He sat down across the table from her, something he had never done. In all the months she had been working here, in all the hours she had spent in this room. He sat down and he put Gareth's letter on the table between them, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I want to talk about the wedding night," he said. She set down her pen. "I've been trying to find the right time," he said, "and I've understood for a while now that I'm waiting for a right time that isn't going to come, because there is no right time for it. There's just saying it or not saying it." She waited. "What I said to you." He stopped. His jaw worked once. I had been telling myself it was practical, that I was being honest with you, which was better than the alternative, that it was a kindness in the way that certain clean, cold things are a kindness. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, something she could hear the way you heard load-bearing pressure in a structure. I understood about 3 months after you arrived that I had been lying to myself about all of it. What were you actually doing? She said. He looked at her directly. Protecting myself, in the stupidest possible way, by making sure you knew from the first night that I didn't need you, so that whatever happened, I'd already established the distance. He paused. I'd learned early that people who came into this house had reasons, that proximity to the title produced a specific kind of performance that looked like loyalty and wasn't. I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. Something shifted in his face. And then you arrived, and instead of trying to get close to me, you just started fixing things, without asking for anything, without making it about me at all. He shook his head slightly. I didn't know what to do with that. She was quiet for a moment. So you kept the distance, she said. I kept the distance, because if I was wrong about you, the distance was protection. And if I was right about you, he stopped. If you were right about me, the distance was just damage, she said. Yes. The library was quiet around them. The fire burned. Outside, the winter grounds of the Blackthorne estate lay under the particular stillness of a December afternoon, the bare trees and the frozen paths she had walked at odd hours with her journal, the places she had made hers without permission. She thought about the wedding night. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, not pushing it away, not pulling it toward her, just letting it be what it was. A wound, real and also survivable. The kind of thing that left a mark you carried forward into what came next, and what came next was either less than what came before, or it was something different, and different was not the same as less. She thought about what she had built here, not despite him, not for him, not entirely, for herself, for the people in the villages who had needed someone to show up, for the woman she had decided to be on a wedding night when the alternative was collapsing into what someone else's cruelty said she was worth. She thought about the key on the plain iron ring, passed across a desk in the dark, and what it had cost a man like him to pass it. I know what I said to you was wrong, Rowan said. I know sorry doesn't do the work that undoes it. I'm not offering you sorry as though it's enough. He looked at her with the eyes that had no armor left in them, that had spent what it cost to stand in an entrance hall against 20 riders, and had nothing left over for pretending. I'm offering you honesty, that I was afraid and I handled it badly, and I have spent the last 7 months watching you hold this duchy together with your bare hands, and I don't know how to be in the same room with what that means about who you are and what I threw away on the first night. She was quiet for a long time. You didn't throw it away, she said finally. You postponed it. He looked at her. I'm not the same woman who walked into your chamber on our wedding night, she said. She was hoping for something. I'm not hoping anymore. Hoping is for people who don't know yet what they're capable of. She held his gaze. What I know now is that I built something here that I'm proud of, and that I did it without your help, and that I don't need your acknowledgement of it to make it real. She paused. What I also know is that you stood in an entrance hall with a wound in your side and told me to stay behind you, and I don't know exactly what to do with that yet. But I'm not doing anything with it. Something in his face shifted. Slow, the way light shifted on stone. Not dramatic, but fundamental. What does that mean? He said. It means I'm not closing the door, she said. It means if you want to start something different from what we've been doing, I'm willing to see what that looks like. But it's going to be honest. All the way through, no architecture, no distance, no deciding in advance what I'm worth, and installing that decision like furniture. She looked at him steadily. If you can't do that, tell me now. I would rather know. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him sit with it, not deflecting, not managing it away, actually sitting with it the way she had needed him to sit with things for months, the way he was only now learning to do. I can do that, he said. Not easily, not with the smooth confidence of a man who said things because they sounded correct, with the effortful honesty of someone who had run out of easier options and was discovering in the absence of them, that the harder option was the only one that actually meant something. "Then we'll see," she said. She picked up her pen. She looked back at the accounts. After a moment, she heard him shift in the chair across the table, not leaving, not with purpose, just settling, staying in the room, staying at the table. She let him. Spring came to the Blackthorne Duchy the way it always came to the Northern Territories. Slowly, with argument, the cold holding its ground weeks past when it should have released. But it came. The east fields that Seraphina had restructured the previous autumn came in early and strong. The village of Turnmouth sent a cart of grain to the estate stores as payment on the previous year's emergency allocation, unsolicited, arriving with a note from Gareth that said only, "As agreed, and then some." She pinned the note inside the cover of her leather journal, the one that had traveled from the archive to the capital to a locked room and back again, that held 7 months of notes and observations and the careful accounting of a woman who had decided to matter in a place where she hadn't been invited to. She was in the East Garden when Rowan found her. Not a Tuesday afternoon, not a library, just a March morning with mud on the path and the first real warmth in the air and the particular quality of light that came when winter finally ran out of argument. He came down the path and stopped beside her, and they stood together looking at the garden she had ordered replanted in November, the one that was now showing the first green, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air. He said, "Darrow's written. He wants to discuss the Northern Trade Compact." "I'll write back today," she said. "He wrote to you," Rowan said. "Specifically. Old school apparently has limits." She almost smiled. She let it go further than usual. Let it actually arrive on her face. Let it stay for a moment, and she felt him look at her, and she looked back, and the space between them was not the space of two people maintaining distance. It was the space of two people who had stopped needing to. "What are you going to tell him?" Rowan asked. "That the Blackthorne Duchy is interested in the compact and would like to arrange a formal meeting." She paused. "That the Duke and Duchess will both be attending." He was quiet for a moment. "Both?" "Both," she said, "if that's what you want." He looked at her the way he had looked at her across his desk with a key in his hand, with the particular expression of a man who had spent a long time building defenses and was learning, carefully and at some cost, that the thing he had been defending himself against was not what he thought it was. "That's what I want," he said. They stood in the March garden in the northern morning, and the light came down through the bare branches of the trees that were starting, at their tips, to show the first barely visible suggestion of green. And she thought about the wedding night, and the 11 words, and the long months of working in parallel, and the locked archive, and the frozen road, and the entrance hall, and the document case, and all the ways two people could be in the same house for 7 months without actually being in the same place. And she thought about what it meant that they had arrived here, not through romance, not through the smooth inevitability of stories that were built from the outside in, but through the specific grinding hard work of two people who had been wrong about each other and had run out of the luxury of staying wrong. She thought, the wound of the first night did not heal, it changed. It became the thing that made everything else possible, because it stripped away every version of this that would have been easier and less real. She did not say this out loud. It did not need to be said out loud. The garden was there, and the light was there, and he was standing beside her on the muddy path with his shoulder close to hers, and that was the thing itself, not a symbol of it. She reached down and picked up the small flat stone at the edge of the path, the kind of stone that ended up in garden borders for no reason, smoothed by time, the color of the winter sky. She turned it in her fingers once. She put it in her pocket. She did not know why. She simply kept it. "Come inside," she said. "I'll write to Darrow. You can read the draft." "You don't need me to read your drafts," he said. "No," she said, "but I'd like you to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They walked back up the path together, toward the castle that was hers now in every way that mattered. Not because she had been given it, but because she had made it so. One decision and one document and one village at a time. Through the specific months when no one was watching and no one was helping, and the only reason to keep going was that she had decided she was the kind of person who kept going. The door opened into the warmth of the hall. She went in. He followed. The door closed behind them both. That was all. That was enough. Sometimes the hardest thing, the thing that cost the most and meant the most and lasted when everything else had burned away, was not the grand gesture or the dramatic reckoning, but the simple willingness to walk through the same door. To choose, every morning, not the person you thought you were getting, but the person who was actually there. She had chosen that. He was learning to. It was, she thought, a reasonable start.